All right, hold on. This goes there. This thing goes in here. And this comes here. And now I speak. Can you hear me okay? All right. So, let me just, first of all, that was music. You might ask, what is music? I have no idea. I don't know what it is. I've had many definitions I've played with over the years. I don't know. And yet, it's so important to me. Now, the instrument, if you're curious, is a new invention. It's from Australia. It's called a tarhu. But let us not dwell on that. Let us suppose for a second that a central casting computer scientist entered the room, of whom there are many on campus, and said, oh, I could have a program analyze what Jeron just played, and I could make more of it. We don't need Jeron anymore. We can have a program make that music. And the interesting thing to say is that from a certain perspective, in terms of just creating the energetic output, that's true. I mean, it's just information. Why not? You could statistically analyze it and reproduce it within some set of criteria or parameters. I have no doubt of that. However, there'd be something stupid about doing that. Because the point of it, I just proved no theorem by playing that instrument. I solved no engineering problem. What I did was something else. I don't know how to define it. The fact that I did it for you here, is the thing itself. It's not reproducible. Or it would be absurd to attempt to reproduce it. That would be to lose the point of it. And yet I can't say what the point is. All right, so this is starting a little mystical. I want to come back to this question of creating music. But first, one point of order I completely neglected to check on. How long should I talk? An hour. Oh, God, okay, you're in trouble. Because there's no clock, so I have no idea. Anyway, I want to go back in history, both my own personal history and our cultural history. When I was young, I learned a certain storyline, a certain narrative about our cultural history, which is familiar to all of us. It's an oversimplification, but it's the way we understand a lot of what's happened in what we call Western civilization, maybe more broadly world civilization, and that is that it used to be that people believed in superstitious things. They believed in mysterious gods and demons and angels and forces, and that with the dawn of science and the embrace of logic and empirical method, the Enlightenment was furthered, and the Enlightenment counterposed these superstitions with a new way of knowing in which we got ever closer to a kind of truth that we could all agree on through a process of repeated experiment, through a process of repeated logical exercises. It created a kind of commonality between us that had not existed in superstition. And furthermore, it was actionable. We could build technologies out of it. We could understand reality well enough to start to make things that we couldn't make before. And that process has been fruitful. We have transformed the world into one that supports a much larger population, in much of it in comfort, not all of it. We've created a world that is both more wondrous and less wondrous, but it's more wondrous for the most part, for me anyway. I'm astonished to see a picture of a black hole in another galaxy. That to me is just like as good as the best birthday ever. It's just amazing that we have this modern world. And so When I had absorbed this lesson when I was a kid. And as I think any bright kid would, I was like, yes, yay, science, and I still am, of course. When I was a teenager, I encountered a person who turned out to be my most important mentor, and his name was Marvin Minsky, who is one of the principal technical minds and storytellers for what we call artificial intelligence. And Marvin, along with what's become quite a large society of other people, have projected an extension to that original story. And the extension is that just as once upon a time we thought people were at the center of the earth and in the universe, and when Galileo said, no, it's easier to think of the earth as going around the sun, he was repressed, he was persecuted. Just as we used to think we were totally separate from the other animals, then Darwin comes along and says, no, we're actually part of a continuity. He was ridiculed, his work was suppressed. And so in just the same way, we think the human mind, human thought, the idea of consciousness is some kind of a special, precious thing, but actually it's just another one of those old superstitions. And we can build machines that can do the same thing, and the enlightened people will realize that and will stop thinking of people as being quite so precious. And this has become the political and economic official normative worldview of our times, even if people individually might not totally buy it. Even if a lot of people are wandering around thinking to themselves, I'm special, or I'm immortal, or I have a soul, or something like that, in terms of their actions, the society that they're integrated into is completely based on this idea that AI has a function a little bit like the old medieval gods. AI will decide who does what. AI decides who you date, what you eat, what you see. AI will take over your job or define a new job. Whoever owns the AI will become the richest and most powerful person in the world, etc. So we all are functionally living within a belief system where this new idea of the person not being special, but technology being sort of the special thing, has become the functional story of our time, the functional myth that we live by, the functional narrative that guides our society. Now, this is a strange turn of events. It's something of, you can think of it as maybe a reductio ad absurdum of one version of the Enlightenment, but I prefer to think of it as a distortion of the Enlightenment. Now, I want to put forward what I think should be an uncontroversial and straightforward proposition, which is that in order to be a scientist or a philosopher, or for that matter, a moral or ethical person, one has to accept the idea of the unknown, and in fact of the fundamental unknown. One has to accept the idea that we might not know everything about everything. So that is not a universally accepted statement these days. I've debated with people who feel it isn't really quite true. For instance, I hate to put words in other people's mouths, but I've had a lot of fun doing public debates with the philosopher Daniel Dennett, and we found that if we scream at each other, people will pay to watch us, although it's been a while since we did it. But at any rate, I think I can characterize his position as saying that there are still many unknowns in science, but they're all contained within a framework that is known, that we can think of the world as being an information process, and what we're working out is the details of it, but we no longer are in a sea of mystery to the horizon. Instead, we're in a fishbowl where the mystery is somewhere between the glass and our island. It's a contained level of mystery, not an unbounded level of mystery. And that's a difference. I believe that the world has an unbounded level of mystery. Now, is that an unimportant academic distinction, or is it an important one? So I want to argue here that that difference is profoundly important, in that there are very strong pragmatic arguments for preferring the position in which you perceive yourself to be in an unbounded sea of mystery instead of a bounded one. Now, I'm a computer scientist by discipline, so I'm going to use examples mostly from computer science, but I will observe that the same arguments can be made using other disciplines as a framework, particularly theoretical physics, but also lately biology, psychology, many others. Now, in computer science, we are subject to a daily drumbeat of what I'd call propaganda of human-machine equivalence, that people aren't special, AI will surpass us, AI can do all the things we can do, that we're nothing special at all. It truly is every day. If you look at your news feed, every day you'll see stories where some program from Google can play music or whatever it might be. I checked this morning, and the latest thing is that some program claims to be better than people at multiplayer games from one of the usual AI places, but it's every single day. It's the only story that's as constant as our political insanity. It's the constant drumbeat of our times. Now, the reason this is so, as I alluded to earlier, is political and economic. We've created a system in which people believe in AI, and as long as you believe in AI, it's effectively real. It's like Tinkerbell or the Wizard of Oz or something like that. Now, I want to give you an economic example of why I object to this equivalence, and then we can dig into a bit of the philosophical underpinnings in terms of my take on the usual arguments about it. But I want to start with the politics and the economics, because ultimately that's where the rubber hits the road for philosophy. Philosophy does matter. Philosophy does change lives. It changes our society. It changes our experience on the ground. And so we have to look at those effects in order to take philosophy seriously. So my favorite example for explaining my distrust of the AI idea has to do with machine translation of natural languages like English. Now, there's a long history to studying this idea of having machines translate languages. There's a celebrated story that my mentor Marvin Minsky, and this was before I knew him, this was in fact before I was born, but in the late 50s at I think the second AI conference, which would have been 59, something like that, he assigned some graduate students a summer project of translating between English and another language. I think it might have been German. And the proposition was simple enough. You'd start with 2 dictionaries. And in those days, computers were so slow that it would take a long time to look up something in a dictionary. You'd have some tape drive whizzing back and forth, but it was doable. You would come up with some model of the grammar of each language. And remember, one of the other faculty members, a colleague of Marvin's at MIT, was Noam Chomsky, who believed that there was some kind of perfect little closed crystalline core that described a language. And so if you could define that little core for the 2 languages and map between it and have the 2 dictionaries, you should just have a translation, right? It was a perfectly reasonable hypothesis. They tried it, it didn't work. And then people kept on trying it and trying it and trying it. An enormous amount of money and many careers were put into this effort until in the late 90s, computers had gotten big enough that we could start to have what we these days call big data, or a large corpus of information. And researchers at IBM found such a large corpus of translations. It was the archive of translations that had been done at the United Nations that was accessible. And they started doing statistics phrase to phrase instead of trying to represent grammar in some perfect way. So they found one phrase here. They would see how that phrase had been translated. And they did incorporate some grammar, but it wasn't like some perfect core of grammar. The crux of it was phrase-to-phrase comparisons. They do a mashup of phrases, and what came out wasn't perfect, but it was readable, and all of a sudden we had machine translation. Now, it's gotten better since then, And according to some metrics, it's either gotten as good or surpassed the average human translator, whatever that means. And these services are completely available for free anytime. The two primary ones are from Google and Microsoft. Microsoft's been my supporter for a long time, and we have one of them, and so I know the inside of it pretty well. And here's the interesting thing about it. Languages are not static. Languages are alive. And so every single day, there are new stories in the news, there are new pop culture stories, there are new slang expressions, there are new songs, there are new memes, if you like, new rap tunes. And so in order to do any reasonable translation, you have to refresh the corpora every single day. So how do you do it? Well, the way we do it is the only way we can do it now. And in fact, given the current structure, by law even, it's the only way we're allowed to do it, which is that we steal it from people who don't know we're taking it. And I don't know any more honest way to put it than that. It turns out there are tens of millions of people around the world who on their own do phrase translations every day. A lot of them are part of amateur groups who do subtitles for foreign movies in whatever language they speak. A lot of them are just family members who are translating for in-laws who don't speak the language, that sort of thing. There's just all kinds of reasons that people translate. And so over the years, we've identified these people, and as I say, tens of millions of them, and we steal their examples every single day. Now, meanwhile, while this has been happening, those people who make a living as translators have seen something terrible happen to their career prospects. They've been destroyed. Now, they followed precisely the same pattern that happened earlier to recording musicians, to investigative journalists, to photographers, to anyone else whose product is completely transferable over the internet. Now, the story is slightly complex, and I'll delve into the math of it just a little tiny bit. What's happened is where there used to be a bell curve of professionals, most of whom made about the same amount of money translating, which was a nice middle class living. They're now between a tenth and a hundredth, depending on the country, of those people making a living, but they're in a zip curve instead of a bell curve. So there are a tiny number of them that have actually become sort of more elite, where they have special jobs translating for a tech executive or something like that. So a small number of them are actually doing better than they used to, but almost all of them have done terribly. So it's complex. It's not and I can go into that. And this question of what makes a bell curve and what makes a zip curve on a network is the ultimate important economic question for the future. But on the average, their careers have been destroyed. So we're in this very strange position where we're saying, you're not needed. You're a buggy whip. Do you all know the reference of a buggy whip? Oh, some people are shaking their heads. Okay, so in the lore and the rhetoric of a certain strain of capitalism, particularly the libertarian kind, one of the tropes that comes up again and again is the buggy whip. So buggy whips were the whips that were used to motivate horses to propel buggies before engines showed up to make cars that ran on gas. And there was an industry making these whips, and it was centered in Rochester, New York. And when Ford Motor Company started selling a lot of cars and people got sick of horse manure in the street and the horses started to disappear, the buggy whip industry just imploded. And these days, there's probably like 3 people making them on Etsy or something like that. But the story goes, as sad as that was for professional buggy whip makers, it was what we call creative destruction in capitalism. And it turned out that Rochester started a new industry, which was in photography. In Kodak and Polaroid, the 2 biggest film camera companies were based there. And so this whole new industry came up. And a lot of the people who had worked in the buggy whip factory started working in camera factories or film factories. Okay, so that's creative destruction. So we're telling all these people, hey, you're buggy whips. You're obsolete. There's a big, giant electronic brain owned by a tech company, and it's doing your job too bad. You should go learn to do something else. Except that we're being dishonest. Except that actually, in fact, we still need them. We're just stealing from them instead of paying them. So the stupidity of this is multi-level. This is not merely a single stupid thing we're doing. One stupid thing we're doing is we're lying. I think lies always come back and bite you, aside from being bad, aside from being ethically bad. I think you can't sustain a society based on absolutely lying about who does what. Secondly, it doesn't give us any opportunity just to ask for the phrase translations we need. In order to create the illusion that we don't need these people, we've kind of anonymized them, and we can't just go to them and say, hey, we really would like phrase translations for the latest pop songs of the week. Can somebody do that, please? We can't do that. And so that means that we have only this indirect way of getting what we need, which makes the whole system less reliable and less useful. That's stupid. A third thing that's stupid is, who do we think our customers are? If we're systematically defunding our own customers, eventually it comes back and destroys us. And there's a very important point here. This is not just about buggy whips. This is potentially everybody. As I pointed out earlier, somebody could come up with a statistical or machine learning basis for reproducing what I played on the instrument or coming up with variations on it to put me out of work. But eventually that means I can't afford whatever it is that company depends on. It's a fundamentally self-destructive, it's an Ouroboros, it's a snake eating its own tail. The society can't sustain if it absolutely disavows the value brought into the world by its citizens. Okay, so we have a lot of stupidity in one little decision here. And why do we do it? Well, this is this funny thing. The giant tech companies, and I should say, I'm not one of those who throws stones at the companies from afar. I'm very much a creature of that world. I've sold a company to Google. I work in Microsoft now. I've worked with some of the others, and it's kind of my world. I kind of like it. And I think most of the people in the big tech companies are perfectly decent, and some of them are very wonderful. And I think there also, a lot of the claims for benefits from them are entirely real. So I'm not anti-tech company per se, but what I want to point out is that we've had this sort of strange, if you want to find out what the operative philosophy or narrative of a culture is or of a society, look at who the richest people are from time to time. Before the Enlightenment in Europe, the richest people were either the Pope or somebody close to the Pope, or Borgias who had some kind of an arrangement, who had a kind of a mafia-like control of a certain society, of a certain part of the world. They were either military or religious people. With the Enlightenment, you started to see industrialists become the richest people. So you would see like oil barons and railroad barons become the richest people. Now it's whoever has the biggest computer or who's the most adjacent to the biggest computer. If you look at the list of the richest companies or the richest individuals, all of them are close to some huge computer that serves as a hub for something. It could be the mobile networks in a third world country or a developing country. It could be one of the social media companies. It could be a hedge fund, some big financial hub, but it's always some giant computer. So we kind of believe in these things. We've treated them as the center of our society. So the ideology that goes along with that economic arrangement is artificial intelligence. Because consider this for a second. Let's go back to the translators I was just talking about. What if those people whose phrase translations were being taken every single day in order to make language translation automatically available? What if they said, hey, we're unionizing, we demand to be paid for our phrase translations. We were making a living before, we're still needed, we should still be making a living. What's wrong with that? Well, what would happen is the center of gravity would shift from belief in the computer to belief in the people who are making the data. Do you see that? The computer is easily replicable, the people are not. The people might be as individuals, but not as a group. If they unionize, that group would not be replicable. Whereas, honestly, we replicate each other's computers all the time. Google comes up with something, Microsoft copies it. Microsoft comes up with something, Google copies it. We can't copy those people. All right? And so if that center of gravity moved, it wouldn't mean the death of tech companies. It would just mean the beginning of a new way to have a sustainable middle class, no matter how much automation there is. Because it would mean recognizing that automation, things done by computers, are ultimately dependent on data from people, and if people were acknowledged as the unique sources of data, then they could make a living, and we could have a society with both high employment and high automation at the same time. But if we don't acknowledge the people and we pretend that all the value is just in the computer, then you have a conflict between dignity and employment and self-worth and status on the one hand, and automation on the other. A highly automated, advanced society would become one with very high unemployment, where everybody would have to be on the dole or impoverished or something. So this question of who we believe in becomes absolutely crucial to the kind of society that we create as we improve technology. It becomes absolutely central. Now, the funny thing about the state of computer science right now is that the orthodoxy of AI is so strong that it's almost impossible even to articulate a way to challenge it. Anytime I say something like this in a computer science context, especially young ones, like undergraduates, will say, but, there's this philosophical thought experiment and that thing, and but, how can you say that? And I can tell you a little bit about some of the rounds of back and forth on that, but ultimately, the thing is, there's no absolute truth about what's going on in our reality, and this gets to, that we have access to. This gets back to my sense that we live on an island surrounded by unbounded mystery rather than bounded mystery. You can have a figure ground inversion, whether you believe the translators are creating the value or the computer, but there's no angel from above who will adjudicate that. We have to choose which figure ground inversion suits us best. I think by any absolute standard, they're equally viable. Now, this whole business of machine-human equivalence has a long history, and I won't go through that whole talk, which I'm sure you've heard elsewhere, but there's a thing about, this whole thing about human labor versus computers exists in Plato. You know, if you go back, there's this crazy thing where he's talking about, these horrible, annoying musicians in the agora, and if only they could be replaced by those golden robots like the one Hephaestus is supposed to make, then we wouldn't have to pay them to stop playing, and they wouldn't annoy us anymore. And there's this joke that's recorded in ancient fragments of text from Athens that you have to pay the musicians in the agora 1 drachma to play and 2 drachmas to stop playing. That joke goes all the way back there. But at any rate, he found whatever they were playing in the agora annoying, which makes me wish I knew what it was so I could play it at conferences. But maybe I've happened upon it on my own anyway. But they were. And so the idea is, like, can't we just get robots to do this? Can't we just expel these people? Why do these people have to live within our cities? And so there was this idea of of machine-human equivalence all the way back then, and Ada Lovelace talked about it, of course. But the real progenitor is Alan Turing. And when I first learned about the Turing test, it was taught to us completely absent any biographical information or any context at all. The idea is just that you take a Victorian parlor game that was apparently popular, where a man and a woman each slip little notes to a judge through some kind of a slit or under a screen or something, kind of the equivalent of tweeting, and then the judge is supposed to try to tell them apart, and if the judge can't, I don't know what that's supposed to tell you, but at any rate, the idea is that you extend it so that there'd be a person and a computer, and if the judge can't tell them apart, shouldn't you give equal rights or something like that? Shouldn't you respect the computer as being essentially the equivalent at that point? And so, therefore, computer science has become all about passing the damn Turing test. And to this day, there'll be just the headline about multiplayer games yesterday. We had a computer play against itself in a multiplayer game, and it got really good, so now it's beat the Turing test for multiplayer games. And it's become this paradigm. And I find it to be really first of all, disrespectful for Turing, because if you actually read Turing's original papers and understand what was going on with him, I don't think this is acknowledging him fully as a person. I'm sure you all know the story by now because it's been made into a movie and now it's familiar, whereas it used to be kind of a hidden story. But Turing was one of the great heroes of World War II. He used one of the first computers to crack a Nazi secret code called Enigma that was supposed to be uncrackable, and therefore probably spared Britain invasion. He was celebrated with a ticker tape parade after the war. As it happens, he was gay. That was illegal at the time. He was subjected to a forced treatment that was supposed to convert him to heterosexuality, that instead he was injected with massive doses of female hormones and other things, and he developed female sexual characteristics that he didn't want and became deeply depressed and apparently committed suicide by eating a cyanide-laced apple by the first computer. This is the story. The Turing test, this story about machine-human equivalence, was something he wrote just in the last weeks of his life, in one short note and in one footnote. And if you read them, they have a profound quality of pathos in context. Turing was saying, here, I worked so hard to defeat the fascists, the Nazis, who were murdering people based on who they were, and now it's happening to me. What the hell is wrong with us? So he talks about how there's this extraordinary passage where he says, you might wonder if a program that passes this test has a soul, and all I can say is everything in this reality has a soul. We all come from God, but we don't always act like it, something like that. It's a kind of extraordinary, the guy was going through an emotional and moral crisis, and here we are, in a way, taking the most banal interpretation of what I think was actually a rather profound scream. Okay, getting back to the undergraduates who always want to argue with me. So they'll say, and it gets to be tiresome to argue these things through. Fundamentally, it's not decidable. It doesn't really mean anything. But one of the ways I try to get that across is with the following point. All the Turing test can do is discriminate, is ask whether a judge can tell the two things apart. Now, there's a possibility that it cannot possibly take account for, which is that the person has made themselves stupid in order to make the machine seem elevated. If a person made themselves stupid, that would make the machine seem smart. Now, we see that all the time when we interact with AI algorithms. You actually do go on a date with the person the algorithm selected. How's that worked out for you? You actually do read what the algorithm suggests. You do get a news feed constructed by the algorithm. In the age of algorithmic news, everyone's measurably become less well-informed. Politics gone crazy all over the world at the same time. That's terrible. So the thing is, people do make themselves stupid in order to make machines seem to be smart, all the time. Now, furthermore, in the classical Turing test formulation, there's two people and one computer. There's the other contestant, the human, and then there's the judge human. So that means there's a 2/3 chance that it's a human who's become stupid instead of a 1/3 chance that it's a computer that's become smart. So speaking generally, there's always a 2/3 chance that somebody's become a moron wherever you perceive AI. Now, that sounds flippant, and it is in a way, but in another way it isn't. I think that that's an accurate description of the world we've created with this point of view. Anyway, so getting back to this big question of whether this idea that people are precious is anti-enlightenment or pro-enlightenment, which is the main gist of my talk here. So for many years, I've interacted with all sorts of people who think dualism means that you would torture Darwin or Galileo. I am a proud dualist, and I'm absolutely convinced that you can be a dualist without torturing Galileo or Darwin. The reason to be a dualist is not to promote any particular dual. In other words, One is not saying that I believe in a Christian or a Jewish or a Hindu cosmos, or that I believe in whatever thing it might be. All it is saying is that I define an area of mystery that is not filled in, that is unbounded. I believe that there's something about the human that is in there. Computer science becomes immeasurably clarified if you take on this point of view. Now, the thing about computers is that the bit patterns have no objective reality without people to interpret them. And this is a thing that's a little hard to see at first, but if you gave your smartphone to some Martian or some other alien, it would effectively be a lava lamp. It would be a thing that generates heat and makes patterns. In order for bits to be intelligible, there has to be some cultural commonality between whoever set the bits and whoever reads the bits. Otherwise, they have no meaning. Otherwise, they're just a pattern. If they're attached to a robot, then the robot can do things that are measurable, but not meaningfully measurable. And that gets into a whole other thicket. But the point is, there's no meaning except from people and computers. And as soon as you understand that, it just becomes easier to design things. And this is something, oh my God, this helps so much. I have been in innumerable meetings where people say, well, we have our natural language system working, except there's a semantics problem. And I'll say, yeah, semantics is just the word for what you can't do. Get a person in there to do that. There's no shame in that. To this day, our machine learning algorithms are still statistical. That's not to say that there couldn't be some semantic model in the future that works. It's just to say that we shouldn't succumb to what I call premature mystery reduction. We shouldn't succumb to believing we know things that we don't out of some enthusiasm for a philosophical destination that we believe we must have already arrived at, even if we haven't earned it. Now, I have noted something remarkable in recent years, which is a kind of a loss of faith that people have in themselves. This hit me the hardest late last year when I was, there was this crazy thing where there was a contest for elite high school students in Connecticut to formulate questions for people who were perceived as tech leaders, and I was the first one up. And so these are all students who've already been accepted to Harvard and everything. They're the very top students. They had to collaborate on these questions, and their first question to me was, if we're going to be surpassed by AI in our lifetime, why are we here? Why did our parents have us? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. If you're bombarded every day with this idea that the machines are about to surpass you, you might very reasonably ask that. You might say, well, for my own economic well-being, I better go work for the company that owns that machine that's surpassing everybody. But you might also wonder, but why? Why am I here? I also note, and here, this is a little bit more speculative and maybe wrong, but I note that a lot of the worst people, the most violent and horrible people, use a language these days of what they call replacement. In Charlottesville, the neo-Nazis chanted, "The Jews will not replace us." The person who committed the massacre in New Zealand mosques started his manifesto with, it's all about replacement. It's about us being replaced. And I think that a lot of, this idea of replacement is really bizarre because it's not like there's any, and I've also seen that in Islamic extremism, this idea that we'll be replaced, we're being overrun. Demographically, it's not true, it's not authentic, and I have to wonder if perhaps, I know, I'm almost done. I have to wonder if perhaps what's going on are people are transferring this impending sense of human obsolescence to some notion that the replacement must be from some other bad human actor. But the constant message they get every single day in the rhetoric from the tech industry is you are being replaced. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. It's absolutely reasonable to say that there is some way that people are a source of meaning. There's some way that people are able to decode bits. There's some way that people have experience. There's some way that people are able to define the subset that you can describe with quantum mechanics, a subset of the world. There's some way that people can serve in this special role, and that's okay. That doesn't, humanism, a belief in humans as special, is different from the other specialnesses that the Enlightenment had to battle, because it gives deference to all of us, not just to a few special benighted people. It doesn't say that just the Pope or whoever owns the biggest computer or whoever owns the oil field is the powerful one. Humanism actually spreads it around. And therefore, I suggest it is the ethical dualism, and in fact, it's the only ethical path there is. So, that's enough.